Good afternoon, everybody. We just finished Game 4 of the World Chess Champion match between Magnus Carlsen and Nepomniachtchi. Just came off a rest day. Today is Magnus Carlsen's birthday as well, so I think most people were expecting a pretty vigorous fight. Did we get that? Let's find out. Carlsen and the white pieces. E4. This is where I started to get a sort of worried feeling in the pit in my stomach in terms of looking forward to a good fight. It's been clear, at least at the top of chess for a while, that e4 is the move where it's hardest to get really serious complications if black is looking for a draw. There'd be no reason why Nepomniachtchi would be looking for a fight today. So seeing e4 on the board sort of made me a little bit worried. E5, that's the most solid move. Knight f3. Knight f6, so at least it's not a Berlin. But it's pretty close. In America and the UK, I believe, this is called the Petrov. In every other part of the world, it's called the Russian game. I think it's more fair to call it the Russian game. But this is a very solid opening from black. Kramnik used this as a pretty good effect back in the early to mid-90s before he discovered the Berlin and crafted that into his new, lovingly beautiful drawing weapon. Kramnik's done so much to take the fun out of chess. It's sad. He's my favorite player, too. Knight e5, this is white's main response. d4, this often just transposes, but it can lead to some interesting complications. d5 is the main move. Knight c6, this is a very interesting concept from, I believe Jakob Murray invented this move. Basically, white's best is to just ignore the hanging piece, because if white tries to take advantage of it, the point is on d5, black gets the piece back, and he's actually a little bit better in a position like this, because he's gaining time against white's pieces. But white's best is just ignore the knight on e4 and continue to develop. But the main move, d5. And this is similar to the Petrov line that we see, except it's completely symmetrical. And we'll see the difference once we get into the game proper. But white chose to take on e5, which is the main line. d6. Knight f3 was played. I have to say a word about my old childhood favorite, the Cochrane Gambit. I mean, it's hardly a gambit. This is just a bad move, objectively. But I just have that soft spot in my heart, because practically, when you look at the database and you actually look at the score, white does incredibly well from this position. Knight c3. Knight c3 is better than d4. d4 c5, unfortunately, takes a lot of the fun out of white's position. So knight c3 is a little bit better. 6. And if it's two computers playing each other, black will untangle and win this. But even from this position, white scores incredibly well. I think he scores 59% from this particular position, with 20 games or so. But yeah, just objectively, it's a bad possession. But subjectively, black's king is a little bit uncomfortable. White has 2 pawns for the piece. The pawns are fairly immobile. It's a good blitz weapon, and that was the context for which I was playing knight xf7 a lot. Was playing this back when on the Internet Chess Club, and the Internet Chess Club was the only real place to play internet chess. But knight f3 is just the better move. Knight c4. d4, that's the main line. There's a huge branch here in modern chess. Knight c3 is the other really major modern alternative. Basically, white's just going to count on his mobilization. One potential line. And white's going to go queenside. And here we have a real fight in our hands. The trend is for black to just hold tight and castle whichever way white goes with his king, which takes a lot of the fun out of the game. Bishop d3, that's an old childhood favorite. It's not very good. c4, I do have to say, is a little bit interesting. But once you actually look at the analysis, any other move here for black makes the game interesting, but knight c6 is the best move. And just leads to an equal game, unfortunately. But still an interesting position, in my opinion. But d4, that is the modern main move. d5. So when we go back to that position we were looking at, the difference is, it's still white to move, but the difference is white's knight is on f3 instead of e5. Now, you might take that to be white losing a move, but not really. It makes a huge difference in the position in terms of what white's able to do. White, in this normal position of the Petrov, tries to prove that this knight on e4 is actually a little bit exposed, and a little bit of a liability for black. So the knight being on e5 versus f3 isn't necessarily an automatic gain or loss for white. Still very concrete. Just a small detail of the position, but the ideas are fairly similar. So c4, the only major move here. White's tried some other alternatives, but c4, hitting back a black central bastion on d5. c6, rook e1, knight c3 is the most popular choice. One potential line from here. Both sides can be happy. You know, white's got these hanging pawns. I've got a course on hanging pawns in this channel. Go give that a look, of course. But both sides can be happy with this version. Basically, white's got good open play for his pieces. He can put his rooks on the b and the e file. But black is very solid. He's going to maneuver this bishop back to g6 to help protect this king. Both sides can be happy here. Rook e1 seems to be the modern main choice in terms of the top level. Bishop f5, queen b3, a quieter approach. White really doesn't have much of anything here. Basically, with hanging pawns like these, white needs his light square bishop to generate activity. Without the light square bishop on the board, these aren't necessarily weaknesses just yet, but white doesn't have the sort of activity or kingside attacking prospects that he needs in this position to claim any sort of initiative or advantage. This is perfectly fine for black. So queen b3 seems the most challenging. Queen d7, the other main modern move seems to be knight a6. This is a little bit more tricky and leads to a little bit more of an interesting game, which when you play the Petrov versus black at the top level, you're not looking for an interesting game, unfortunately. But cd... The point of this is queen x b7 is losing. Knight b4, so now suddenly the bishop here is hit. The bishop can't retreat because it has to hold the c2 square. If we protect the bishop with our queen, we just hit the queen and then we take the bishop. So rook e3 is forced. Queen f6. And then suddenly the white queen on b7 is trapped. You actually see this a lot in some variations of the French Tarrasch and other poison pawn variations where the queen taking is just immediately getting cut off, and the queen has no good way to get back to civilization. So knight c3 is more circumspect. This is one potential line. Bishop e6 is also seen here. But I would say white actually has a little bit of something to work with here. f3 can always be played to knock this knight away, whereas the knight on e5 is completely secure. But in this case, bishop g5 is a good move, getting developed first. And then we take the pawn. Here this line ends with, oh, white has a pawn here, black has a bishop pair in exchange for the pawn, and especially this light square bishop could be tremendously strong for black. But a pawn is a pawn, and I would say, until evidence shows otherwise, white should be for your choice here. So, knight a6 is more interesting, but it does seem a little bit more shaky for black. Queen d7 looks like the most solid. It's holding this b7 pawn, plus defending this bishop on f5. It's the most logical move. Knight c3. So this is the most played move here. I would say, especially after this high-profile game, white's going to be looking at other places, because sort of foreshadowing Carlsen didn't really get anything in this game. c5, maybe the fashion is going to move towards that. Because at least, I think this is equal, but at least this is in balance, and at least white has a little bit of extra space to work with. Knight c3 just turns out to liquidate pretty quickly. So, all of this is basically just force. These are just forced exchanges, which makes white's task even more difficult, because we've had 2 sets of minor pieces just get vacuumed off the board. It's hard to get dynamic activity or chances when material starts disappearing. Queen b5, bishop a3 is another logical choice. The bishop on c1 is a worse piece than the bishop on d6, so trade a bad piece for a good piece. But black is in time to maneuver his knight to a5, which gets to this beautiful hole on c4. And when you play against the hanging pawns, blockading the hanging pawns with the knight is a generally positive positional goal. Black is absolutely fine here. So queen b5 is a little bit more testing. a4, defending the queen. And then a5. This is a very logical move. Before, this pawn on a7 is a backward pawn. It could potentially be weak. Here, all of a sudden, if white doesn't take en passant, it's a protected pass pawn. It can be pretty strong. Bxa6 is natural. And I would say if we continue to see this line, people are just going to go back to taking an a6, because Carlsen didn't really get much of anything in this game. And this is a microscopic edge for white. This is a micro edge. This is something you could maybe milk for a little bit, or for a while, and occasionally get a win out of. It doesn't really seem much of anything for white, but I think it's actually more than the game. Carlsen played knight h4 here, which is... It's interesting, because it's relying on getting this knight to favorable routes to massage this tender d pawn or that tender b pawn. Now, the downside is, black suddenly has this protected past a pawn, and there's suddenly an urgency for white that he has to go for liquidations or go for sharper variations than otherwise, because if we just play quietly, this asset on a5 is pretty strong. Now, this seems to tactically just work out for white, but not in terms of an advantage, just in terms of balancing out the past a pawn. So I don't think we're going to see this fashion continue at the top. So g6, that's necessary. We have to stop the knight from getting into f5 with tempo. g4, this is a very lovely move. So the route for the knight's going to be hopping to g2 to e3, where it'll pressure this e3 pawn. There's also another route for the knight possible, which we don't see in the game, but g2 to e3 to d1 to b2 to a4, where that knight pressures the weak b6 pawn. That's a little bit extravagant, and you're a little bit less likely to see that, but it is an idea. g4 is better than just g3, because this g4 pawn eventually ends up useful, going to g5 to help support an outpost on f6 and help restrain these kingside pawns. So, excellent move from Carlsen. That's a wonderful, long-term strategic move. Knight d7 getting developed. g2. Rook fc8. Knight f6 is an alternative, but I think rook fc8 is more practical. As usual, I have the game notes in the comments to give that a look, but rook fc8 looks simplest and best, putting the rook in the open SC file. Bishop f4 just in time, so we're trading off that passive bishop for this active bishop on d6. Next d5, so we've liquidated that weak c3 pawn for this d5 pawn. Suddenly we have dueling passed pawns. It does make the position a little bit sharp, but both sides are up to the task of calculating here. Rook e7, rook e4 is an excellent move to take a lesson from if you're an improving player. Don't make your rook passive like this in any sort of endgame ever. In any sort of endgame, especially double rook endings like this, with any sort of with or without any sort of material on the side, activity trumps everything. Get your pieces active. Rook e4. This is just like the game, except it's worse for white, because this rook, instead of being on the strong 7th rank, it's stuck guarding this suddenly weak, isolated, blockaded pawn. When you're in an ending, and in a rook ending, get your pieces active. Get your rooks active. Activity above all in rook endings. So that's absolutely the correct move. Knight f8. Not the only move. Knight xb6 deserved a serious look. King h6 is a creative attempt to keep the game going. King g8 is just... And this is sort of a long force variation. And f5 just in time to make a move for this king. This is just a dead draw. King h7 tries to keep the game going. But it's just so... basically, the fundamentals of this game are hard to change. This strong passed a-pawn from black really prevents white from making any significant progress on either side of the board. And that was the strategic risk that Carlsen took on by playing that knight h4 move to begin with. He's getting play that balances the a-pawn out, but it's not enough to do more than that, because that passed a-pawn is so strong. So knight xb6 is a try, but it doesn't do anything more than maintain equality. So Carlsen played knight f6. King g8, that's the most normal move. King h8 is actually, if black wanted to think about continuing the game, it is possible. One potential line. And I like this move g5 here. It suddenly creates this track for this knight to hop to g6 to f4. Black has enormous compensation for the pawn. I think here it's complete and full compensation. Maybe in a different mindset, Nepomniachtchi would have considered a move like that to try to keep the game going, but obviously here he was happy to get a draw with black. d5, so again, endgames are all about activity. Black has a strong passed a-pawn. White needs to achieve his own play to balance it out. So white gets his own passed pawn moving. Of course, the rook can't take that because knight f6 check and loses. Black plays a4, again, eminently logical. There's a couple other alternatives, but a4 is the most straightforward. Get your passed pawns moving. That's one of the main goals of any endgame. g5, eminently logical. There's a couple other alternatives, but this is the most logical, just cementing this knight in place. I mean, white can just end up offering the draw here, but g5 is an attempt to keep the game going. And then a3. Again, this was a strategic risk that Carlsen took on to begin with in this opening, and we're seeing black logically push this pawn down. It puts the onus on white to find any sort of play to justify continuing the game. And with a pass pawn on a3, it's very difficult to find that sort of play. And at this point, Carlsen went in the tank for over 40 minutes between the next few moves. There's just nothing... There are some positions that are quite murky that he most likely examined for that 40 minutes. Knight f6 was played. h4 can continue. There's a lot of variations here, but the main one that I saw... here, black is simply going to take on d6 and then take on e7. Again, the original strategic risk Carlsen took on, keep pushing that passed pawn. That's the entire point of any ending. Knight f6, we had to prevent rook e8. And then king g8. That's the last accurate move. This king is going to slide to h7, where it's perfectly safe, and it's going to attack this weak h-pawn. White's just not making progress. This is still completely balanced. There's a couple other lines in there, but h4 is a decent enough try to keep the game going. There's also quite a bit of risk that white gets overextended. So knight f6 keeps the perpetual in hand for now. And then this is the final moment where white could have continued playing on. King g2 would be sort of a micro-improving attempt to sort of keep the ball rolling. Again, unfortunately, the original strategic risk that Carlsen took on, he needs to find that sort of play that justifies having a passed a-pawn on a2. And it's just impossible to find that sort of play that gets you more than a perpetual or equality. The best that white can do here, rook e8, rook e2, we have to neutralize that pawn, guards it. d6 would be an example of Carlsen going too far. Knight e8. Let's check there. And there's really nothing better for white than just take the perpetual anyways. d6 gets overextended pretty quickly. And this is a long and fairly forced variation. I'll just show it as an example of what could happen. I would guess that Carlsen is seeing variations like this, if not exactly this variation. White is down a pawn. White still has this passed D pawn, but for now it's securely blockaded. I don't see a way for White to break the blockade of the D pawn. I would say Black is slightly for choice here, and White is actually running a little bit of a risk of playing a position like this. Carlsen really was in the tank for quite a while for the past couple of moves from here, so I would guess he was looking at positions like these for a way to at least get some practical chances, or a way to some sort of tactical measure of getting his D-pawn through, and he just didn't see anything. There are some other lines in there. Give the game comments a look. The whole game file will be there as usual. But Carlsen eschewed all of these. I mean, above all, Carlsen's a very practical player. He's never been the sort that burns bridges. This is only the 4th game, and it's still tied, and he's still world champion. It's a disappointment, but a draw. There's no point in going for more from a position like this. And at this point, the opponent shook hands. Fairly logical game. It has to be labeled a bit of a disappointment for Carlsen. I would say the original sin of this game is actually move 1. Especially when you look in contrast what Carlsen was able to get out of game 2 when he played d4 and went for the Catalan. That turned into a razor-sharp game where both sides eventually had some sort of winning chances at different points in the game. It is incredibly difficult to get winning chances with 1e4 at the top level if Black is not interested in a sharp game. Whereas d4 or even c4, White can get those sort of strategically imbalanced positions where he can at least make a go at getting winning chances out of the game. But as the game went, Carlsen had a bit of a piece of preparation, but it just... another logically played game where it just never left the drawing zone. So, bit of a disappointment for Carlsen, but he's going to put it out of his mind. He's going to be Black against Nepomniachtchi tomorrow. We'll see you then.